The woman in 2A was already annoyed before takeoff. She flagged down the flight attendant, pointing at the man beside her with a scowl. "I'm not sitting next to that. He smells like diesel." The man didn't say a word, just sat quietly in his worn military jacket. Boots dusty, hands folded. She demanded he be moved. Loud enough for everyone in first class to hear? The flight attendant hesitated. She glanced at the man, polite, calm, mid-50s, clearly not causing any trouble. Then at the woman still waiting, with her phone in hand. "Sir, would you mind moving to another seat? I'm so sorry, The man stood without a second thought. "I've been moved before. It's fine. Let me tell you about Walter James Monroe. He's 55 now, with calloused hands and gray at his temples. For 24 years, he wore the uniform of a United States Marine. 3 combat tours, a Silver Star for bravery that sits in a drawer at home, wrapped in tissue paper not because he doesn't value it, but because he's never been one to make a show of things. These days, Walter works at Jimmy's Auto Repair downtown. Gets there at 7, leaves at 5, does honest work with his hands. Still calls his customers sir and ma'am without thinking about it. Still keeps his hair neat and his boots clean. Old habits from a life lived with purpose. That military jacket he was wearing, it wasn't a costume or a statement. It was just part of who he was. The patch on the sleeve, 3rd Battalion, the 1st of March Eanes that was from Fallujah, 2004. A place where boys became men, and some men never made it home. Walter doesn't talk about those days much. When people ask what it was like over there, he usually just says, "Hot, dusty. We did our job." But if you could see the letters he still writes to Gold Star mothers, or the way he quietly pays for coffee for young veterans at the diner on Saturdays, you'd understand that some battles never really end. Today was different, though. Walter was flying for a reason that made his chest tight. Danny Kowalski, the last surviving member of his squad from that deployment, had passed away the week before. Heart attack at 52. Walter was flying to Milwaukee for the funeral not because Danny had family who invited him, but because Danny didn't have family left, and someone needed to be there to remember. The ticket to Milwaukee had cost him 3 weeks of overtime, but some promises you keep no matter what. The woman in 2A had noticed Walter the moment he sat down. Designer handbag, perfectly styled hair, the kind of person who took first-class flights for granted. She looked at his dusty boots first, then at the worn spots on his jacket, then at his weathered hands. "Why would someone like that be in first class?" she muttered to her companion, not quite quietly enough. When the flight attendant approached, looking uncomfortable, Walter could see this wasn't the first time she dealt with this kind of situation. Customer service meant keeping the peace, even when peace came at someone else's expense. "Sir, I'm so sorry about this," she said quietly. "Would you mind? There's an open seat in coach that might be more comfortable for everyone." Walter had heard those words before, different versions of them. In restaurants where his uniform made people uncomfortable, at hotels where desk clerks assumed he couldn't afford the room he'd booked. He'd learned long ago that some fights weren't worth having. "No big deal, miss. I've been moved before." And so, the man who had once carried wounded Marines through enemy fire walked to the back of the plane, past rows of passengers who didn't look up from their phones or magazines. Just another inconvenience resolved. Another problem moved out of sight. But here's what Walter didn't know. The flight attendant who had seated him originally, Sarah Martinez, had asked him about his trip while helping him stow his bag. "Heading somewhere nice?" she'd asked, making conversation. "Memorial service," Walter had replied simply. "One of my guys from the unit. Last one left." Sarah had served in the Army Reserve herself. She recognized something in his voice, the weight that comes with being the last one standing. She passed that information along to her colleague, who passed it to the flight crew chief, who walked straight to the cockpit. Captain Robert Hayes had been flying commercial jets for 15 years. Before that, he'd been an Air Force pilot. He understood something about service that went beyond customer service. When the crew chief told him about Walter Monroe, about the Silver Star, about the memorial service, about being moved from his seat because of how he looked, Captain Hayes felt something click into place. He'd seen too many good people treated poorly because they didn't fit someone else's idea of what belonged where, and he wasn't about to let it happen on his aircraft. 5 minutes before the cabin doors closed, Captain Hayes stepped out of the cockpit. No emergency, no delay, just a decision that needed making. He walked to the front of the cabin, removed his captain's hat, and waited for the conversations to quiet down. "Ladies and gentlemen, I need your attention for just a moment." The cabin fell silent in that particular way that happens when authority speaks calmly. Earlier today, a passenger on this flight was asked to move from his seat in first class. His name is Walter Monroe. He served 24 years in the United States Marine Corps. He's a Silver Star recipient that's awarded for exceptional bravery in combat. He fought in places most of us have only seen on the news. Captain Hayes paused, letting that sink in. He was asked to move because someone didn't like how he looked. You could hear the air conditioning humming. "That's not happening on my aircraft." Captain Hayes walked down the aisle, past the woman in 2A who was staring at her lap, past the business travelers pretending to read emails, straight to row 23 where Walter sat with his small bag on his knees. "Sir," Captain Hayes said, extending his hand, "I'd be honored if you'd come back to seat 1A. That's where you belong." As Walter walked back up the aisle beside Captain Hayes, something shifted in that airplane cabin. Not a dramatic transformation, this isn't a movie, but something real and quiet and important. A man in row 3 stood up as they passed. "He can have my seat," he said to the captain. "He's earned a better one than I ever will." Others nodded. A few more passengers stood, not making a show of it, just acknowledging something that needed acknowledging. The woman in 2A said nothing. Her face was red, her posture rigid. When Captain Hayes paused beside her row, he didn't lecture or shame her. He simply said, "First class isn't about the seat. It's about how you treat people." Then he tipped his hat to Walter and returned to the cockpit. Walter settled into 1A without fanfare. He didn't gloat or make eye contact with the woman who'd complained. He simply sat down, fastened his seatbelt, and looked out the window like he'd been doing this his whole life. As the plane taxied to the runway, Sarah Martinez, the flight attendant who'd first spoken with Walter, slipped him a folded piece of paper. "My father served too," she'd written. "He never talks about it much. You reminded me today why what he did mattered. Thank you." Walter read the note twice, then folded it carefully and slipped it into his jacket pocket. Right next to his boarding pass, and the program from Danny Kowalski's memorial service that he'd printed from the funeral home's website. The rest of the flight passed without incident. No viral videos, no standing ovations. Just a man in 1A, looking out at clouds, thinking about a friend he'd lost, and a kindness he hadn't expected. When they landed in Milwaukee, Walter was among the first to deplane. He shook Captain Hayes' hand as he left. "Thank you," he said simply. "Thank you," the captain replied. That was it. No speeches, no grand gestures. Just two men who understood that respect isn't given based on appearances, it's earned through actions, and it's shared through simple human decency. Walter picked up his rental car and drove to the funeral home where Danny Kowalski lay in state. He wasn't the only one who came. 3 other Marines from different units had made the trip. They stood together for 20 minutes, sharing stories and remembering a man who'd served his country and deserved to be remembered. The woman from 2A probably forgot about the incident within a week, but Walter Monroe kept that note from the flight attendant in his jacket pocket for months afterward. Not because he needed the validation, but because it reminded him that sometimes, when you least expect it, someone stands up for what's right. Captain Hayes didn't make a big deal about what he'd done. That's not why he did it. He did it because, in a world where it's easy to look away, sometimes someone has to look directly at what's happening and say, "Not here, not today." And Walter, he went back to his job at Jimmy's Auto Repair, fixing engines and treating every customer with the same quiet respect he'd always shown. Because that's who he was, not because of a patch on his jacket or a medal in his drawer, but because of the man he'd chosen to be, one day at a time. You never know who you're sitting next to. The person beside you might be someone who once carried wounded soldiers to safety, or taught children to read, or worked 2 jobs to put their kids through college. They might look different than you expect. They might smell like diesel or coffee or the outdoors. But before you judge the boots, the jacket, or the silence, Remember this: everyone has a story. Everyone has earned their place in this world somehow. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is simply treat them like they belong there. Because they do.